Welcome to the Bullvine Weekly Roundup, your go-to podcast for the latest and most critical news in the dairy and livestock industry. And today, we're diving into the top stories that have shaped the week. From shocking events in Lancaster County to global market shifts, we've got you covered. Let's get started. Our first story takes us to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where a series of senseless livestock shootings has left farmers devastated. The attacks have sparked an outpouring of community support and raised urgent questions about rural security.
Okay, so when you picture Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, you probably imagine, peaceful farms and those horse-drawn buggies, right?
Yeah, like a slower pace of life, right?
Exactly, like this pocket of tradition. Mm-hmm. But recently, a really unsettling story has been coming out of this community.
Right.
Like, imagine waking up, on a normal morning.
Yeah.
Not to the, sounds of a farmyard, but to this shocking discovery of devastation.
Wow.
Like valuable livestock just senselessly gunned down.
Oh my God.
In a pre-dawn attack.
Yeah.
It's the kind of news that makes you just stop and think, no matter where you live.
Absolutely. This is not just some local crime story.
Right.
It really sends ripples way beyond Lancaster County because it touches on how we live.
Yeah.
Where our food comes from, the people who produce it, their hard work and livelihoods.
Right.
And that sense of security we all kind of count on in our communities, whether they're rural or urban.
So in this deep dive, we're going to unpack what happened with these livestock shootings. We want to go beyond just the headlines, and really try to understand the impact and why this story should matter to you.
Yeah, it should.
And to do that, we've been looking at, the story as it's unfolded out of Lancaster County.
Right.
And what's really striking is how much this has disrupted a community known for being tight-knit.
Yeah.
Everyone supports each other.
That's really been shattered.
Yeah.
What's really fascinating and concerning right away is this suggestion of coordination in these attacks.
Right.
It wasn't just a single isolated act. Mm-hmm. Multiple dairy farms were targeted.
Yeah.
In those early morning hours.
On Saturday, March 15th.
Yeah, pre-dawn.
Right.
It implies that there was a deliberate effort to cause widespread damage.
Right.
And to really instill fear within the farming community.
The details, that are emerging talk about Coleraine Township.
Yes.
Specifically around Schoolhouse Road near Georgetown Road, where 2 dairy cows were found dead around 11 a.m.
Wow.
And it was the owner who had to make that discovery.
Oh my gosh.
And it's important to remember, these weren't just anonymous cows, right?
Right.
These were productive dairy animals.
Yeah.
It represents a huge financial investment in years of careful breeding.
Precisely. The economic impact here is really crucial to understand.
Right.
Each of these cows isn't just an animal. It's a vital part of a business, a source of income.
Yeah.
Representing long-term planning and dedicated care.
Right.
The financial loss goes way beyond just the cost of the animal.
Yeah.
What's truly concerning is that cascading effect.
Right.
It's beyond the immediate loss of milk production. Mm-hmm. It impacts breeding lines, future herd growth, and even the farmer's ability to secure loans.
Right.
This isn't just about replacing an animal. It's about rebuilding a core component of their business.
And the attacks weren't limited to Coleraine Township.
No.
The same perpetrators apparently moved on to Sadsbury Township along South Vintage Road.
Right.
And they targeted more animals there.
Oh, gosh.
A horse was shot. Thankfully, it survived.
Oh, wow.
But another cow died from its injuries.
The fact that multiple locations were targeted and different types of livestock really suggests a level of planning and intent that's concerning.
Right.
The authorities, investigating these incidents were examining evidence at multiple sites in the southeastern part of the county.
Right.
So the full scope of this crime spree might be even wider than we initially understood.
But amidst all this really disheartening news,
it's
been inspiring to see how the community has rallied.
Right.
It's that classic, neighbors helping neighbors thing. It's so vital in agricultural communities.
Yeah, it plays out in real time.
Right.
This is where you see that lend-a-hand spirit that's so essential to the strength of rural communities.
Right.
It kicks into action.
And almost immediately, a fundraiser was set up online to help these farm families deal with the unexpected veterinary bills.
Yeah.
And to begin that long process of replacing the cows they've lost.
Mm-hmm.
And it really, brings home the point that we were making about these animals being so much more than just livestock.
Right.
They're integral to the farm's entire operation and the family's livelihood.
Replacing them is a huge undertaking.
Right.
Not just in terms of cost, but also the lost potential for future production.
What's been interesting is just how quickly that support network kicked in.
Right.
It says a lot about the deep interconnectedness within the agricultural community.
Yeah, you know what they say, the person you help out today might be the one you need to rely on tomorrow.
Right.
There's a profound understanding of shared vulnerability and the absolute necessity of mutual support in this way of life.
But this incident also really shows some of the unique security challenges that rural farms often face. Like, so often these operations are located in pretty isolated areas with maybe minimal natural surveillance.
And potentially less of a law enforcement presence.
Right, compared to more densely populated urban centers.
That very isolation, while often part of the appeal and character of rural living, does create a distinct set of security vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
It can inadvertently make these farms easier targets for people with criminal intentions.
Right.
The fact that these people could move between multiple farm locations in the pre-dawn hours undetected raises serious questions about the security measures in these areas.
And it's prompting a lot of important questions for dairy producers.
Yeah.
Not just in Lancaster County, but all over the country.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, how visible are your barns and pastures from public roads?
Right.
Is there enough lighting?
Yeah.
Have you considered security cameras? Especially at entry points.
Right.
What's your emergency response plan? And do your insurance policies cover livestock losses from criminal acts?
Those are all incredibly critical questions to think about.
Yeah.
A security specialist actually said something really important.
Okay.
Dairy operations often invest so much in their herds, but might overlook basic security measures that could cost a fraction of the loss of even one animal.
Right.
Simple things like lighting, managing who has access. Even inexpensive game cameras can make a difference.
Sobering thought, isn't it?
It is.
Like, no one wants to turn their farm into a fortress, but this really shows the need to address these vulnerabilities. That peaceful rural lifestyle we cherish does come with risks that we maybe haven't fully appreciated until now.
That's true.
And there are some really practical, immediate action steps that are being encouraged for dairy producers.
Right.
And anyone who cares about our food supply, first is to support those affected in Lancaster County by contributing to that online fundraiser.
Right.
Any amount can help these families recover.
Absolutely. The second crucial step, and this is something anyone can consider, is for every farm to look at their security.
Yeah.
Reviewing and enhancing security measures around livestock areas.
Those motion-activated lights, trail cameras, or even more comprehensive security systems
has become more critical than ever.
Right.
Thirdly, vigilance within the community is key.
Yeah.
Reporting any suspicious vehicles or individuals to the authorities immediately could prevent future incidents or help the investigation.
The call is also going out to share information.
Yes.
If you hear about similar incidents, make sure those are reported and that information is shared within farming networks.
So we can create a broader awareness and maybe identify patterns that might otherwise go unnoticed.
Finally, and this is especially important for anyone listening, who might know anything about these shootings in Lancaster County?
Right.
You're urged to contact the Pennsylvania State Police in Lancaster.
Yeah. Even small pieces of information could be really valuable to the investigation.
Beyond these immediate actions, this event brings up a bigger, more systemic question.
Yeah.
How are crimes that target agricultural operations viewed and prosecuted?
Right.
Compared to other types of property crimes?
This is a really important point to consider.
Yeah.
These weren't just random acts of vandalism.
Right.
They were calculated attacks on agricultural livelihoods.
Right.
And there's a concern that these types of crimes in rural areas may not get the same attention from law enforcement or carry the same penalties as similar crimes in urban settings.
And the information even suggests that there have been similar livestock shootings in neighboring counties.
Oh, wow.
In recent years with what many felt were insufficient consequences.
Right.
This potential disparity in how society values and protects farming operations is a serious concern.
It is a concern for the future.
Yeah.
What's both fascinating and troubling is this being described as agricultural terrorism.
Right.
While that term itself is loaded, it shows that these acts don't just impact individual farmers.
Right.
They threaten our whole food production system.
Yeah.
If people can target livestock with a low risk of consequences, then every farm is more vulnerable.
So as the investigation continues in Lancaster County, it's clear that this story has implications beyond that community.
It does, for sure.
It reminds us of the vulnerabilities in rural areas, the importance of community support, and the need for a conversation about how we value and protect those who produce our food.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's go over some key takeaways.
Okay.
On Saturday, March 15th, multiple dairy farms in Lancaster County, specifically in Coleraine and Salisbury townships, were targeted in coordinated livestock shootings.
Right.
This resulted in the loss of valuable cows and a horse.
And beyond the purchase price, these farmers face huge financial losses.
Potentially up to $92,000 per cow.
Wow.
When you consider their lifetime milk production potential.
But in this tough situation, the community has shown incredible resilience.
They have.
By organizing support through that Give, Send, Go fundraiser.
Right, which really shows the solidarity in the agricultural community.
Right.
However, the incident also highlights the security vulnerabilities that many rural farms face due to their isolation and sometimes limited law enforcement.
Yeah.
This really emphasizes the importance of proactive security measures.
Like improved lighting and surveillance.
Exactly.
And it's a call to action for anyone in agriculture to be vigilant, report suspicious activity, share information about similar incidents. And if you know anything about the Lancaster County shootings,
you need to contact the authorities.
Finally, this incident raises a really important question. Do crimes targeting agricultural operations get the same attention and consequences as other property crimes?
Despite their potential impact on our food system.
And the livelihoods of those who sustain it.
Exactly.
As Lancaster County farmers rally together, another tragedy reminds us of the importance of safety on the farm. Let's turn to Ohio, where a heartbreaking loss is teaching valuable lessons. Reed Hostetler's untimely death due to preventable equipment failure has sent shockwaves through the dairy community. His story underscores the need for stricter safety protocols and better awareness on farms worldwide.
We've been talking a lot about, how tight-knit the dairy farming world is and about, relying on safety and how strong the community is.
Right.
And that kind of brings us to this, really sad event that happened with Reed Hostetler.
Yeah, it was a really sad day for the farming community in Marshallville, Ohio, back on March 5th, 2025.
Wow.
When Reed passed away, and he was only 31.
So young.
And, this deep dive that we're going to have today is, it's more than just recounting the events that happened. It's about understanding, all the different pieces of this and, remembering Reed and what he did and kind of extracting some fundamental truths about, farm safety and how these communities, really step up and support one another.
Absolutely. And I think, like you were saying, it's so important to, we're going to delve into what made Reed such a vital part of this community.
Yeah.
How they all came together when this awful thing happened. And I think most importantly, we're going to examine what this means for safety on farms like this and specifically thinking about manure storage.
Exactly.
So why don't we start by getting a clearer picture of Reed himself?
Yeah, I think the thing that really strikes you is that Reed was more than just a guy that milked cows. He was a co-owner of Eleanor Dairy Farm.
Okay.
And so he was really invested in every aspect of the operation.
Wow.
And, people who knew him talked about how good he was mechanically. Like if something had an engine or gears, Reed could fix it.
Oh, wow.
Which on a modern farm, that's super valuable.
Yeah, that's a huge asset.
Yeah. And then on top of that, he also had really good business sense.
Oh, wow.
Which is something you really need in today's dairy industry.
Absolutely.
So,
I mean, it really, like you said, it challenges that simple image of just a farmer.
Right.
I mean, clearly he was wearing a lot of hats and, he was working the land, but it sounds like he had all these other experiences too.
Yeah.
He hiked a big part of the Appalachian Trail.
That's right.
Which, to do that, you have to be pretty tough and tenacious.
Definitely takes some grit.
And he was a bull rider.
That's right.
Which, I mean, come on, that's pretty fearless.
That's not for the faint of heart.
No, it's not.
No.
And then, also he went to Thailand to do mission work.
Yeah.
And that just shows, how much he cared about helping other people.
Yeah, he was really committed to helping others, that's for sure.
Yeah. So that's just, really paints a picture of somebody who lived life to the fullest.
Yeah, he embraced it with passion and purpose.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it all the more heartbreaking for his family.
Yeah.
He leaves behind his wife, Abby, and 3 really young kids.
Yeah.
Bear, who's 4, Claire, who's 2.
Oh, my gosh.
And little Axe, who's only 1.
Oh, that's just heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's just unimaginable, the kind of void that they're facing now.
It really is devastating. But, one of the bright spots, and I think we saw this in the research too, is just how quickly the Marshallville community came together to support them.
Yeah.
It really shows you how strong and interconnected these farming communities are.
Well, it's almost instinctive the way that they mobilized.
Yeah.
Neighbors didn't wait to be asked.
Right.
They just stepped in right away to make sure that, things kept running at L&R Dairy Farm.
Right, taking care of the animals.
Taking care of the animals, all the daily stuff.
Wow.
They organized meals for the family.
Mm-hmm.
And most importantly, they offered that, that emotional support that's so important at a time like this.
I mean, it wasn't just practical help.
Right.
They also gave a lot of financial support too.
Yeah, that's right.
The GoFundMe was just incredible how generous people were.
Yeah, and that really underscores, that sense of shared responsibility that they have in the dairy community. It reminds us that even though farming can be kind of a solitary profession,
right,
when times get tough, there's a really powerful safety net.
Absolutely.
And it's there waiting to be activated.
Yeah. And I think if we zoom out a little bit, it just speaks to what makes these agricultural communities so unique.
Right.
It's generations of shared experience.
Absolutely.
Understanding the challenges of farm life.
Yeah, the ups and downs.
Yeah, and just that sense that, we're all in this together.
We're in this together.
And when one family hurts, the whole community hurts.
That's right.
And that's what we see, and how they respond.
Yeah, it's a real demonstration of their values.
Absolutely. So this tragedy has also brought up something really important that we need to talk about, and that's safety on dairy farms.
Right.
And specifically when it comes to manure storage.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think the first step is just understanding the risks that are already there.
Manure storage is just part of modern dairy farming, but it's really dangerous if you're not careful.
Right.
There are 2 main risks that we have to be aware of.
Okay, let's break those down. So the first one is these toxic gases that can form.
Right.
How does that happen and what makes them so dangerous?
Well, when manure decomposes, it releases gases naturally. Things like hydrogen sulfide, which is super toxic.
Yeah.
Methane, carbon dioxide, and ammonia.
Wow. So it's not just one thing, it's a whole cocktail of dangerous stuff.
That's right. And they can build up really quickly.
Okay.
Especially if you're agitating the manure.
Right, like when you're mixing it?
Yeah, exactly, when you're mixing it before you use it as fertilizer.
So it can happen suddenly then?
Yeah, because when you agitate it, all those gases get released really fast.
So it's not just something that builds up slowly over time?
Not necessarily, no.
This could happen during regular work on the farm?
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to understand how these gases work.
Yeah.
So we can, keep everyone safe.
Yeah, and I remember in the research, Dr. Thomas Sanderson from Iowa State University.
Right, I know Dr. Sanderson.
Yeah, he's done a lot of research on farm safety.
He's the expert.
And he was saying that during agitation, the hydrogen sulfide levels can just spike.
Yeah, super fast.
Like really fast.
Yeah, in just a few minutes.
Wow, that's scary.
Yeah, it's definitely something to watch out for.
Yeah, so that's definitely something to be aware of. And then the other risk you mentioned was physical entrapment.
Yeah, right.
What's the danger there?
So liquid manure, it's really thick and dense.
Right.
Almost like a slurry.
Yeah.
So if you fall in, it's really hard to get out.
Oh, gosh.
You could drown, you could suffocate.
Oh, wow.
And the thick liquid can actually suck you in.
So you can't even pull yourself out.
Right. Makes it even harder to escape.
Gosh, that's a really scary thought.
Yeah.
So knowing all of this, what are some things the dairy farms can do to be safer around manure storage?
We got to be proactive.
Yeah.
The most important thing is to protect the storage areas themselves.
Okay, how do you do that?
So first, you put up a strong fence all the way around.
Okay.
To keep people and animals out.
Mm-hmm.
And then you put locks on all the gates.
Yeah.
And then you got to have clear warning signs at every entrance so people know it's dangerous.
Right, right. And then I guess you'd also want to have something to keep the tractors and equipment away from the edge.
Exactly. You need barriers to stop them from getting too close.
Okay, so that makes sense. Just keeping people away in the first place.
Right. Prevention is key.
But what about, using technology or something to monitor the area?
Yeah.
Are there any tools that can help?
Yeah, definitely. So there are personal hydrogen sulfide monitors.
Okay.
They're like little devices you wear. And if the hydrogen sulfide gets too high, they'll set off an alarm.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. And then ventilation is really important too.
Okay.
Especially in enclosed spaces.
Like the barns?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
You need good airflow to keep the gases from building up.
Right.
So you can use natural ventilation, or you can use fans.
Fans, okay.
And, with any equipment like that, you got to check it regularly, make sure it's working properly.
Right. And then just having a plan, like a set of steps for when you're doing something like agitating the manure.
Exactly. You need clear procedures.
Yeah.
So everyone knows what to do and how to stay safe.
Okay. So it's a combination of, keeping people out and then using technology to warn you if something's wrong.
Right.
What about, the actual work that you do around manure storage? Are there any specific practices that are safer?
Yeah, the Farm Safety Association has some good recommendations.
Okay. What do they say?
Well, one of the simplest things is to always work with a buddy.
Okay.
That way someone can help you if something happens.
Right. So you're not out there alone.
Exactly. And it's really important to be able to communicate.
Yeah.
So use radios or hand signals.
Okay.
So you can let each other know if there's a problem.
Right. And then I guess you'd want to have really specific instructions for anything you're doing with the manure.
That's right. Detailed protocols for things like agitation and transfer.
Okay.
And those protocols need to be followed every single time.
No cutting corners.
No cutting corners. And always make sure there's plenty of ventilation whenever you're working with manure.
Okay.
And then another really basic thing is to stay away from the edge of the pit when you're operating equipment.
Just common sense.
Exactly. Like common sense, but it's easy to forget sometimes.
So it sounds like a lot of it comes down to, planning ahead, being really careful and following all the safety rules.
Right. You got to be meticulous and you got to be aware of your surroundings.
Yeah. Are there any resources out there that can help farmers, put all of this into practice?
Oh, yeah. There's tons of resources.
Okay.
You can talk to your local agricultural extension office. They can give you advice specific to your farm.
Okay.
And a lot of insurance companies actually offer free safety assessments.
Oh, wow.
So they'll come out to your farm and help you identify any potential hazards.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, it's really helpful.
And then OSHA has guidelines specifically for manure storage.
That's right.
Okay.
And there are a bunch of farm safety organizations that offer training programs and educational materials.
So there's really no excuse for not knowing how to be safe.
Right. The information is out there if you look for it.
And that brings us back to the community aspect.
Yeah.
It's not just about each farm doing their own thing.
Right.
It's about working together.
Exactly.
So how can the community help with safety?
Well, farmers can share information with each other.
Okay.
If someone finds a safety measure that works really well, they can tell their neighbors about it.
Right.
And neighbors can check in on each other.
Yeah.
Especially when someone's doing something risky.
Right.
Like agitating manure.
Yeah, to make sure everything's okay.
Exactly. And some communities even pool their money together.
Oh, wow.
To buy expensive safety equipment.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Yeah, so everyone can benefit.
That's really smart. And I guess just talking about safety more openly.
Yeah.
Making it okay to ask for help.
Exactly. Create a culture of safety.
Yeah, and it seems like that's already happening, with how they all rallied around Reed's family.
Right. They really came together to support each other.
So hopefully that same spirit can help prevent something like this from happening again.
I hope so.
Yeah. It's just a reminder that farming can be dangerous.
It's a tough job.
Yeah. And we need to do everything we can to keep each other safe.
Absolutely. And if we all work together to improve safety, we're honoring Reed's memory.
Absolutely.
In a really meaningful way.
Yeah, it's about protecting other families from going through the same thing.
Right. It becomes a shared responsibility.
Yeah, and we know the dairy community is strong.
They are.
So they can definitely do this.
They can support each other and keep each other safe.
So, it's not just about remembering Reed. It's about making sure that his legacy includes a commitment to safety.
Absolutely.
And I think that's something that everyone in the agricultural world can get behind.
I think so too.
It's just a really powerful story of community and resilience.
It is.
And a reminder that we all need to be looking out for each other.
That's right.
So, I guess as we think about all of this, the loss of Reed is just a huge reminder of how strong the dairy community is.
Absolutely.
And how important it is to be safe.
Especially when it comes to manure pits.
Absolutely.
There are real dangers there.
Yeah, and we need to take them seriously.
No doubt about it.
So for our listeners out there,
what
can you do?
think about what we've talked about today.
Yeah.
And think about how you can make your farm safer. Maybe talk to your neighbors about it.
Yeah.
Share some ideas and look out for each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, we've mentioned some resources today, so check those out.
Yeah, there's a lot of help available. And, once again, we just want to send our condolences to Abby and the kids.
Yeah.
And the whole Marshallville community.
Our hearts go out to them.
From personal loss to financial vulnerability, our next story shifts focus to the hidden risks revealed by collapsing egg prices. The egg market collapse has exposed financial weak points in dairy operations. This urgent analysis highlights how price volatility can impact your farm and offers strategies to safeguard against future shocks.
Okay, so you've sent us some really interesting stuff this time. A lot of it seems to be about how stable are markets, really, and specifically you're asking about the dairy market.
Yeah.
I mean, it's no wonder, right? I mean, you're looking at what happened recently with, another big part of agriculture and wondering, could that same kind of thing happen to dairy?
Right. Exactly.
So today what we really want to do is sort of get into all this information you've sent and figure out what are the warning signs, what are the things that could go wrong in the dairy market, and how can our listeners be, prepared for those possibilities?
Yeah. And I think a good place to start is with something that seems unrelated at first, but actually might be like a canary in the coal mine.
Okay.
The egg market.
Uh-huh.
Recently saw some really dramatic shifts, and those shifts could be a warning for dairy, even though, they're different products.
Right.
But we need to understand what happened with eggs to see why it matters for dairy.
Okay, so let's dive into this egg thing. What exactly went down?
The numbers are pretty shocking, to be honest.
Okay.
Wholesale egg prices, they just completely tanked, plummeted 48%.
Oh, wow.
Went from $8.05 a dozen down to $4.15 a dozen. And this wasn't a slow, gradual decline.
No.
This happened over just a few weeks.
Wow.
Late February, early March of this year.
So that's a huge drop, and it happened fast. What was going on?
Yeah, and I think that's the really important thing to notice here. It wasn't a gentle easing down of the market.
Right.
It was boom, sudden drop.
Yeah.
And what drove that was basically consumers hitting their limit.
They just said no more.
They just said, these prices are too high. We're not buying it anymore.
Right.
And that's a really crucial lesson for dairy farmers to be aware of.
Because it could happen to them too.
Exactly. Consumers have a lot of power when they decide they're not willing to pay a certain price anymore.
Okay, so for anyone out there who's thinking, my business is milk and dairy products, this egg thing seems pretty irrelevant. Okay. I want to make sure we connect the dots for them. Why should they care about this egg market crash?
Well, the thing is, eggs and dairy, they have some important similarities when it comes to how they're produced and sold.
Okay.
Both of them are perishable.
Right. They go bad if you don't use them.
Exactly. You can't just let them sit around forever. And the other thing is, their production isn't easily adjustable.
Right. You can't just turn off the milk tap or tell the chickens to stop laying so many eggs, right?
Exactly. It takes time to ramp production up or down. So if demand suddenly drops, you can end up with a lot of product you can't easily get rid of.
Oh, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of it like that.
And remember, this egg price crash, it happened right before Easter and Passover.
Uh-huh.
Those are usually times when egg demand goes up because of all the baking and cooking people do.
Right.
So the fact that prices still plummeted, even with those holidays coming up, it suggests that consumer price resistance, it can overpower even seasonal increases in demand.
So even though, there's a certain time of year when people usually buy more of something, if the price is too high, they're just going to say no.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a powerful reminder that consumer behavior can really shift quickly.
Wow. Okay, so we've got this sort of case study almost of what happened with eggs. Now let's talk specifically about dairy. Are there people out there who are looking at this and saying, this might be something we need to worry about in milk too?
Yeah, absolutely. There are dairy economists who are definitely paying attention to this egg situation and wondering if there are some parallels to dairy.
Okay, who are some of the experts we should be listening to?
Well, you've got folks at places like Cornell University. They have a program called Pro Dairy.
Okay.
They're really focused on the economics of dairy farming. And then you've got the University of Wisconsin-Madison. They have their Center for Dairy Profitability.
Mm-hmm.
And both of these groups, they're starting to kind of sound the alarm a little bit. They're looking at what happened with eggs. And they're saying, okay, are there any signs that something similar could happen with milk?
And what are they finding?
Well, it's not a perfect one-to-one comparison. Eggs and milk are different.
Right.
But there are enough similarities that I think it's worth paying attention to.
Oh, okay. And, I do remember reading something by a dairy economist from Wisconsin. I think his name was Dr. Mark Stevenson.
Yeah, he's really well respected in the field.
And he was kind of saying that, dairy might be a little bit different from eggs in terms of how consumers react to price changes.
Yeah, that's right. He was pointing out that historically the demand for dairy products, it hasn't always been as sensitive to price swings as eggs have been.
Okay.
So in other words, even if milk prices go up a little bit, people don't necessarily immediately stop buying it.
Like they still need their milk for their cereal and their coffee.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And he also highlighted that the dairy sector, it has a lot more variety in terms of products.
Oh.
You've got your liquid milk, of course, but then you've also got cheese, yogurt, butter, ice cream, all these different things.
Right. So it's not just one single product like eggs.
Exactly. And that diversity in the dairy market, it could potentially help to kind of cushion the blow if one particular category, if milk prices spike, for example, maybe people will just switch to more yogurt or something.
Okay. So it's not a perfect analogy to eggs, but even with those differences, those experts are still saying, this egg thing is worth paying attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a wake-up call.
Okay.
It shows that, consumers are not afraid to push back on prices. And when they do, the effects can be really sudden and really dramatic.
Right.
And we are starting to see some signals within the dairy market itself that, maybe things aren't quite as stable as we thought they were.
What kinds of signals are we talking about?
Well, the USDA, they recently revised their forecast for milk prices.
Okay.
They actually lowered their projection from $23.05 per hundredweight down to $22.60.
Okay, so that's not a huge drop. But
It's not a huge drop, but it's significant. Because, in the dairy industry, margins are already pretty tight.
Right, every penny counts.
Exactly. And this price adjustment, it's happening at the same time that dairy farmers are facing all kinds of rising costs.
Like what?
Feed costs, energy costs, labor costs, all those things are going up.
Right.
So this kind of mirrors what was happening in the egg market before those prices crashed. Prices were high, input costs were high, and then boom, demand just fell off a cliff.
So we might be seeing the same kind of setup in dairy right now.
It's a possibility that we need to be aware of.
Okay.
And another thing that's kind of adding to the uncertainty is that the USDA, their projections for dairy product prices have been a little bit volatile lately.
Like they're going up and down.
Yeah. At first they were projecting increases, then they had to adjust them downwards. And all of this volatility suggests that maybe the market's trying to find its footing.
Right. Maybe it's not sure which way it's going to go.
Exactly. And that can make it really hard for dairy farmers to plan for the future.
Okay. So we've got these signs that, consumer demand might be softening. Maybe prices are a little bit too high. We're not really sure what's going to happen with demand. But there's another big factor in all of this, right?
Yeah.
And that's these alternative proteins that are coming onto the market.
That's right. And the timeline for those alternatives becoming really competitive, it's sped up quite a bit.
Oh, really? Like how soon are we talking?
Well, the projections are showing that plant-based alternatives, those are already out there. They're already pretty popular.
Yeah.
And they're either already at price parity with traditional animal products or they're about to be.
Wow.
And then you've got proteins that are made from microorganisms like fungi and yeast.
Okay.
Those are actually expected to hit price parity as early as this year.
This year. Wow.
Yeah. And then even further out, you've got these cultured proteins, the ones that are grown in a lab.
Right. The so-called lab-grown meat and stuff.
Exactly. And those are projected to be cost competitive within the next decade.
So that's not that far off.
No, it's not.
And that must be pretty concerning for the dairy industry.
It is. I think it's something that they need to be taking very seriously because it means that relying on just being cheaper than the alternatives, that's not going to be enough anymore.
Especially if consumers are already starting to push back on prices anyway, right?
Exactly. You've got this kind of perfect storm brewing.
Uh-huh.
You've got consumers who are becoming more price sensitive, and you've got these alternatives that are becoming more affordable and more appealing.
Right. And so if dairy prices stay high and these alternatives are cheaper, well, people are just going to switch over.
That's the risk. And once those consumers make that switch, they might not come back.
Right. They might just decide that, the alternative is good enough and it's cheaper, so why bother going back to the traditional dairy?
Exactly. And one of the things that's really changing the game with these alternatives is this technology called precision fermentation.
Precision fermentation, what's that?
So it's kind of like brewing But instead of brewing beer, you're brewing specific proteins.
Like milk proteins.
Yeah, exactly.
Huh.
They can use this process to create things like beta-lactoglobulin.
Beta-lactoglobulin.
That's one of the main proteins in whey.
Oh, okay.
And they can also make different types of casein.
Right. Those are the proteins in milk.
Right. And the key here is that these proteins that they're making through fermentation, they're not just similar to the ones in cow's milk. They're identical.
Wow. So it's not like a plant-based milk that's trying to taste kind of like milk. This is actually the same stuff.
Exactly. It's molecularly identical.
Okay. So does that mean that, the argument that traditional milk has all these unique nutritional things that you can't get anywhere else, that's not true anymore?
Well, it's getting more complicated.
Okay.
It's true that traditional milk has a really complex nutritional profile with a lot of different components that we're still learning about.
Right.
And those might be harder to replicate exactly through fermentation or other methods.
Okay.
But for a lot of people, the main thing they care about is the protein content.
Sure.
And if they can get that same protein from a source that doesn't involve cows and it's cheaper, well, that's a pretty compelling argument.
Okay, so this is a lot for dairy farmers to think about. Right?
Yeah, it's a lot to digest.
And I'm wondering, are some parts of the country more vulnerable to these pressures than others?
Yeah, definitely. And there's actually a tool that's been developed to assess this. It's called the U.S. Regional Vulnerability Index.
The U.S. Regional Vulnerability Index. Okay.
And it looks at different factors like consumer behavior in different parts of the country and how much competition there is from alternative proteins and things like that.
Okay.
And what it shows is that California, it's actually facing the highest vulnerability right now.
Really? California?
Yeah, they have a score of 4.6 out of 5 on this index.
Wow, so that's pretty high. Why is California so vulnerable?
Well, it's probably a combination of things. California tends to have higher concentrations of people who are already maybe a little bit more price sensitive.
Okay.
They're also more likely to be aware of and have access to these alternative protein options.
Right.
So it's kind of like the perfect storm for dairy vulnerability.
On the other end of the spectrum, who's doing the best?
On the other end of the spectrum, you've got the upper Midwest.
Okay.
They have the lowest vulnerability score, 3 out of 5.
So they're doing pretty well. Why is that?
Well, probably because dairy is such a big part of the culture there.
Right.
People have been drinking milk and eating cheese for generations, and they might be a little bit less likely to switch to alternatives.
Okay, so you've got California at one end, the upper Midwest at the other. What about the rest of the country?
Yeah, so the Northeast scores pretty high on this vulnerability index, 4.3 out of 5.
Wow. Yep.
And then the Southeast is kind of in the middle, 3.6. The Southwest is a little bit higher at 4.1.
Right.
And then Wisconsin, which you might think would be really low, given how much dairy they produce.
Right.
They're actually a little bit higher than the upper Midwest. Overall, they're at the 3.1.
Interesting.
So yeah, it really varies across the country.
Okay, so given all this stuff we've been talking about, like, what can dairy farmers actually do?
It can feel like that, but the point isn't to scare people. It's to give them tools to be prepared.
Okay, good.
And there are things that dairy farmers can do to protect themselves and their businesses.
Okay, good. I was hoping you were going to say that.
So there are 4 main strategies that I want to talk about.
Okay, let's hear them.
The first one is what I call setting up a price sensitivity detection system.
A price sensitivity detection system, what is that?
It basically means that you need to actively figure out where that breaking point is for your consumers.
Okay, so like how much are they willing to pay before they say no more?
Yeah, exactly. And this applies whether you're selling your products directly to consumers or if you're going through wholesale channels.
Okay.
The key is to not just assume that you know what your customers are willing to pay. You need to actually test it and find out.
So how would a dairy farm actually do that? Like, are they supposed to be doing market research surveys and all that stuff?
Well, for farms that sell directly to consumers, it can be as simple as trying out different prices for their products.
Okay.
Like maybe they run a special for a week and see how sales respond. Or maybe they raise the price a little bit and see if people stop buying.
Okay.
They could also just talk to their customers, get feedback, ask them what they think about the prices.
Right, just have a conversation.
Exactly. For farms that sell through wholesale markets, it's more about staying in close contact with their processors. Get data on what's selling at retail at different price points, see how sales fluctuate when prices change seasonally, and keep an eye on what's happening with those alternative products in their markets. And the interesting thing is that research has shown that farms that actually do this that actively monitor and respond to price sensitivity, they tend to do better financially.
So there's a real payoff to paying attention to those price signals.
Exactly. And it's not just about reacting after the fact. It's about being proactive and anticipating those changes.
Okay, so that's the first strategy. What's the second one?
The second strategy is product diversification.
Product diversification.
Okay. But I don't just mean making 5 different kinds of cheddar cheese.
Okay.
This is about thinking about diversification in 2 different ways.
Okay.
The first way is what I call processing depth.
Processing depth.
So this is about moving beyond just selling raw milk.
Okay.
Raw milk that's like the most basic level, primary level of dairy production.
Okay.
But you can go further than that. You can start doing more processing on the farm.
Like what?
Well, maybe you start making yogurt or some simple fresh cheeses.
Okay.
That would be the secondary level of processing. Then maybe you move into aged cheeses, specialty butters, that kind of thing.
Okay.
That's the tertiary level. And then you can even go further and start creating these really unique, high-value specialty items.
Like what kinds of things are we talking about?
Could be anything from really unique artisanal cheeses to flavored butters to dairy-based desserts. Get creative.
Oh, I like that.
That's the quaternary level of processing.
So you're basically saying that the more steps you take in the processing chain, the more diversified your products become.
Exactly. And that gives you more options. If one market starts to soften, you can shift your focus to another one.
Okay, so that's processing depth. What's the other dimension of diversification?
The other dimension is market channel diversity.
There's a channel diversity.
So instead of just relying on those big commodity wholesale markets, which can be really volatile, you can start exploring other ways to reach consumers.
Like what?
Well, you could set up a farm store and sell directly to people. You could sell online through your own website or through farmers markets. You could partner with local restaurants and cafes who are looking for high-quality local ingredients.
Right. Those farm-to-table places are really popular now.
Exactly. And you could even look into exporting your products to other countries.
So the basic idea is don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. And research has actually shown that farms that have more diverse market channels, they tend to have much less fluctuation in their income when markets get rough.
Okay, so diversify. Got it. What's the third strategy?
The third strategy is to invest in technology that gives you market flexibility.
Okay, technology that gives you market flexibility. So that's different from just, buying the latest and greatest equipment that's going to make you more efficient.
Right. It's not just about being efficient. It's about being able to adapt quickly when the market changes.
Okay.
Because if you can't adjust your production or your products when consumer demand shifts, you're going to get left behind.
That makes sense.
And there's actually a way to kind of assess this. They call it the Market Volatility Protection Score.
The Market Volatility Protection Score. Okay, who came up with that?
The Dairy Innovation Hub at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, they developed it.
Okay, so how does it work?
They basically look at different technologies that dairy farmers might invest in, and they rate them on how well those technologies can help them adapt to market changes.
Okay, so like what kinds of technologies get high scores on this Market Volatility Protection Score?
Well, things like precision feeding systems.
Okay.
And advanced herd management software, those tend to do really well because they give you a lot of control over your inputs and your production levels, so you can make adjustments quickly if you need to.
So you can respond to the market in real time.
Exactly. And investing in on-farm milk processing equipment, that also gets a pretty good score because it gives you the ability to change what products you're making.
Right. If demand for milk goes down, you can switch to making cheese instead.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But things like robotic milking systems, those might be great for efficiency.
Yeah.
But they don't necessarily give you that same level of flexibility to quickly change your production.
Okay.
So they might get a lower score, and then things like renewable energy systems, those are really important for sustainability and long-term cost reduction.
Right.
But again, they might not have a huge impact on your ability to quickly adapt to market changes.
So it's all about picking the right technologies for your specific needs and goals.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that there are also things that the industry as a whole can do to help stabilize the market.
Okay, like what?
Well, the National Milk Producers Federation, they've been talking a lot about the importance of better market coordination and maybe some policy changes that could help smooth out those price swings.
So it's not just about individual farms, it's about the whole system working together.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about price sensitivity detection, we've talked about product diversification, and we've talked about investing in flexible technology. That's 3 What's the fourth strategy?
The fourth strategy is about building value beyond just price.
Building value beyond just price. Okay, what does that mean?
It means that you need to give consumers a reason to choose your products, even if they're not the absolute cheapest option on the shelf.
Okay, so how do you do that?
Well, one example is focusing on consistently high quality.
Okay.
Going above and beyond the minimum standards, really making sure that your products are the best they can be.
So you're building a reputation for excellence.
Exactly. And where it's legally allowed, producers could work together to kind of pool their resources and market their products collectively.
Okay, that's interesting. So it's like a cooperative approach.
Right. And another thing is developing unique value-added products.
Okay.
Things that you can't find just anywhere. Things that have a story behind them, a connection to your farm or your region.
Right. So you're giving people something special, something they can't get from those big industrial producers.
Exactly. And then you've got brand development, creating a recognizable brand that people trust and that they associate with positive things like sustainability or animal welfare, right, or supporting local farmers.
Right. So it's not just milk. It's milk from a farm that I believe in and that I feel good about supporting.
Exactly. And there's some good examples of this if you look at the Canadian dairy system.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
They've been pretty successful at building a strong brand and a sense of value around their dairy products.
And they've been able to kind of weather those price storms a bit better because of that?
Yeah, I think so. And there are also some cautionary tales.
Mm-hmm.
There are examples of dairy industries that kind of resisted innovation or got complacent because they thought they were protected and they ended up struggling.
Right. So even if things seem stable right now, you can't just rest on your laurels.
Exactly. You've got to be constantly looking ahead and thinking about what's next.
Okay, so we've talked about 4 main strategies for dairy farmers to kind of protect themselves from these market pressures. Are there any other sort of like red flags, warning signs that they should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, there are some specific things that can indicate that consumers are starting to hit that breaking point on price.
Okay, like what?
Cornell's Pro Dairy program, they've identified 5 key warning signs.
5 key warning signs. Okay, I'm all ears.
The first one is if you see the gap between retail prices and farm prices widening.
Okay.
So what that means is that processors and retailers, they're absorbing some of those price increases instead of passing them on to consumers.
Okay, but that can't last forever, right?
No, eventually it puts pressure back on farm gate prices because those processors and retailers, they're going to start pushing back and saying, we can't keep taking the hit on this.
Right, they need to make a profit too.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's warning sign number 1. Warning sign number 2 is if you see inventory levels starting to rise.
Inventory levels. Okay, like what kinds of inventory?
Well, particularly things like cheese and butter. If you see those stockpiles growing and it doesn't seem to be for any seasonal reason, that's a sign that demand might be slowing down.
Okay.
Warning sign number 3 is if you see private label market share increasing.
Private label market share. Okay, so that's like the store brand stuff. Right?
Exactly. And when consumers start switching from those name brand dairy products to the cheaper store brands, that's a sign that price is becoming a much bigger factor in their decisions.
Okay, so they're trading down to save money.
Exactly. Warning sign number 4 is if you see purchase frequency declining.
Purchase frequency, okay.
So that means that people are just buying dairy products less often.
Okay.
And that could be because they're trying to be more budget conscious, or it could be because they're finding alternatives that they like better.
Okay, so it's a sign that maybe dairy isn't as essential to their diet as it used to be.
Right, exactly. And then the 5th warning sign is substitution within dairy categories.
Substitution within dairy categories. Okay, so like what does that mean?
It means that maybe people are switching from premium cheeses to more basic cheeses.
Okay.
Or they're switching from organic milk to conventional milk.
Right, so they're still buying dairy, but they're choosing the cheaper options.
Exactly, and that's another sign that they're hitting that price limit.
Okay, so those are 5 really concrete things that people can watch for.
Yeah, they're all things that you could track and measure, and they can give you an early warning that, maybe some changes are coming.
Okay, that's really helpful. No, you mentioned earlier a case study of a dairy farm that had done a good job of kind of diversifying and being prepared for these kinds of challenges.
Yeah, Maplewood Dairy in Vermont, they're a great example.
Okay, tell me about them.
So they'd gone through some tough times a few years ago when milk prices dropped, and they realized that they needed to do something different.
Okay.
So they started making their own cheese on the farm.
Okay.
They opened up a farm store so they could sell directly to consumers.
Mm-hmm.
They started selling online. And they also partnered with some local food co-ops
Okay, so they really diversified their market channels.
Exactly. And they also really focus on their brand.
Okay.
They emphasize their pasture-raised practices, their commitment to sustainability, all of those things that consumers are looking for.
So they were giving people a reason to choose their products beyond just the price.
Exactly. And it worked when conventional milk prices dropped again last fall. Maplewood's revenue only went down by 6%.
Wow, that's pretty impressive compared to the 17% drop that a lot of other farms experienced.
Yeah, it's a huge difference. And the owner of the farm, he's been really vocal about the importance of paying attention to price sensitivity and being proactive about adapting to market changes.
Okay, so that's a really encouraging example.
Yeah, it shows that it can be done.
Okay, so I think we've covered a lot of ground today, but I want to make sure that we leave our listeners with the key takeaways.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the big thing is that what happened in the egg market, that price collapse, it's not just an isolated incident.
Right. It's a warning sign for the entire agricultural industry, including dairy.
Exactly. And the reason it's a warning sign is because it shows how quickly consumer behavior can shift.
Yeah. And when consumers decide they're not willing to pay a certain price anymore, the effects can be really dramatic and really fast.
And the dairy industry is facing this kind of double whammy right now.
Yeah. On the one hand, you've got consumers who are getting more and more price sensitive. And on the other hand, you've got these alternative proteins that are getting cheaper and better all the time.
And so the old playbook of just focusing on efficiency and producing as much milk as possible, as cheaply as possible, that might not be enough anymore.
It's not enough. You need to be thinking about diversification. You need to be thinking about market flexibility. You need to be thinking about building a strong brand and a loyal customer base.
You need to be thinking about all of those things.
Yeah. You need to be proactive. You need to be adaptable.
Yeah.
And you need to be really in tune with what your customers want.
Okay. So that's a lot to think about.
It is.
And for anyone listening out there, we encourage you to take some time to really think about this.
Yeah. Think about what's happening in your region.
Think about how prepared you are for these potential changes.
Look at those warning signs that we talked about. See if any of them are starting to show up in your market.
And don't be afraid to reach out for help if you need it.
There are resources out there. There are people who can help you navigate this.
Okay, great. So we've given you a lot to digest today.
We have.
But hopefully it's been helpful.
I hope so.
While some markets struggle, others are seeing unexpected surges. Let's explore how butter prices are defying predictions. Butter prices have skyrocketed by 27%, catching many off guard as USDA forecasts remain bleak. This story unpacks the factors behind this surge and what it means for producers moving forward.
All right, so we're diving into some interesting stuff in the dairy world today.
Yeah, definitely.
We've got this, this kind of a strange situation on our hands.
Yeah.
Butter prices in Europe have absolutely exploded, like up 27% compared to a year ago.
Right.
You'd think, okay, boom, dairy market must be on fire. Everyone's making money.
Yeah, you would think.
But then you see the USDA, right here in the U.S.
Right.
They're actually lowering their outlook for milk prices in 2025.
Yeah, it's a real head scratcher, isn't it?
It is. So that's what we're going to unpack today.
Yeah.
Why are we seeing these seemingly conflicting signals?
Yeah.
What's really driving this?
Absolutely.
And most importantly, what does it mean for, anyone listening out there?
Right.
For their dairy operation?
Absolutely, because that's the real takeaway here.
Yeah.
This isn't just about some, abstract market data.
Right.
This is about understanding the forces that are shaping the industry.
Exactly.
And ultimately what it means for your bottom line.
Exactly. And we've got there's some really interesting information to dig into today.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at market reports, actual price data.
Right.
And then we've got those USDA projections for 2025.
Yeah, the USDA outlook is always interesting.
It is.
Gives us a kind of a glimpse into, what they're thinking,
right,
where they see things headed.
Yeah. So let's get into it.
All right, let's do it.
So one of the first things that really jumps out is this real divide between the value of fat and the value of protein.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's stark, isn't it?
It is. And, the numbers coming out of Europe are pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
Butter prices, like you said, up over 27%.
Right.
Cheddar curd, almost 19% higher.
Wow.
Mozzarella cheese, almost 16%.
Right.
And this is all compared to last year. But then on the flip side, you've got skim milk powder, which is, your protein side of things,
right,
only up a little over 1%.
Yeah.
And in fact, it even dipped a bit this past week.
Wow. So there's a clear preference for fat right now.
Yeah, it seems that way.
And one of the things that we saw that really really highlighted this was this quote.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
It said, "The days of being paid for whitewater are numbered. The market is screaming for fat while protein values struggle."
Yeah, that's a pretty powerful statement.
It is.
And it really gets to the heart of this shift we're seeing.
Right.
The market is placing a premium on fat.
Right.
And if you're a dairy producer, that's something you really need to pay attention to.
Yeah, so what does that mean for producers?
Well, it means thinking strategically about how they can, maximize the fat content in their milk.
Right.
We're talking about things like nutrition.
Right.
Making sure the cows are getting the right feed.
Right.
To optimize for fat production. And even, looking at genetics.
Yeah.
Breeding for cows that naturally produce milk with a higher fat content.
It's not just about volume anymore. It's about the components.
Oh. It's about producing the type of milk that the market is demanding.
Exactly. So we've got this clear signal from Europe.
Yeah. Strong demand for fat.
But then you've got the USDA and their outlook.
Yeah.
And it's almost like they're looking at a different world.
Yeah. It is interesting, isn't it?
It is.
Because they've actually lowered their forecast
for
the all milk price in 2025 by a full $1.
A whole $1. That's significant.
Yeah.
It's now down to $21.60 per hundredweight.
Right. And that's per 100 pounds of milk.
Right.
Just to clarify.
For anyone who's not familiar with the term.
Yeah.
So, and it's not just the price.
Right.
They've also lowered their production forecast slightly.
Yeah. From about 102.92 million tons down to 102.6 million tons.
Right. And what's interesting is they're attributing that to a
decrease in milk production per cow.
Right.
Which is kind of counterintuitive.
It is, because you would think with all the advancements in genetics and management practices.
Right. You'd think we'd be getting more milk per cow.
All right. So what's going on there?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but it suggests that they're anticipating some other factors that might be impacting milk yield.
Like what could these be?
Well, it could be things like, broader economic conditions.
Right.
Maybe they're seeing some signs of a slowdown in consumer spending, which could impact demand for dairy products.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Or it could be shifts in international trade.
Right.
Maybe they're anticipating changes in import-export patterns.
Right.
That could affect overall milk supply.
Yeah, so it's not just about what's happening on the farm.
Exactly.
It's about these bigger macroeconomic trends as well.
Right. And, the USDA is looking at all of that when they're making their forecasts.
And these downward revisions aren't affecting all types of milk equally.
Right.
Class 3 milk, which is, often used for cheese.
Right.
Class 4 milk, which is used for butter and milk powder.
Right.
Those are facing even steeper declines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The forecast for Class 3 milk is down $1.15 to $17.95 per hundredweight.
Right.
And Class 4 milk is down 90 cents to $18.80.
Right. So that's going to be a real concern for producers whose milk goes into those categories.
Absolutely, because, their profitability is directly tied to those prices.
Right. And there's this warning that really stood out to me.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
It said, "Are you basing your expansion decisions on government forecasts that change dramatically monthly? That's a dangerous game few can afford to play."
Yeah, that's a sobering thought.
It is.
And, it highlights the fact that these forecasts, while they're valuable, they are just that they're forecasts, they're predictions, and they can change as new information becomes available.
And they do change.
They do. So, you can't just blindly rely on them.
You got to take them into account.
Right.
But you also need to have your own, your own analysis, your own risk management strategies.
Absolutely. You've got to be thinking for yourself.
Right. So let's shift gears a bit.
Okay.
Let's talk about what's happening in Europe in terms of production.
Right.
Because it's interesting, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, we're seeing some pretty significant declines.
Right. France, their milk production is down 1.7% compared to last year.
Right.
And Germany, which is a huge player.
Yeah, they're a major producer in the EU.
They're down 2.2%.
Yeah, those are big drops.
They are. And Germany, they account for almost a quarter.
About 23%
of all EU milk production.
Yeah, so that's a significant chunk.
It is. So what does that mean for the European market?
Well, it likely means that processors are going to be facing a more competitive environment.
Right.
When supplies tighten, everyone's scrambling to get the milk they need.
Right, and that could drive prices up.
It could.
But then you have Denmark.
Right.
They're actually seeing an increase in production.
Yeah, they're up a little over 1%.
Right. And not only that, but their milk is really high quality.
Yeah, they've got high component levels.
Right, like 4.63% fat.
Yeah.
And 3.75% protein.
That's impressive.
It is.
And their milk solid collection is up too.
Yeah, about 2%.
So they're really focusing on quality.
They are.
And it seems to be paying off.
Yeah, so it's not just about how much milk you produce.
Right.
It's also about the composition of that milk.
Absolutely.
The quality, the components.
Right, because those components are what drive value.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got these kind of contrasting trends in production.
Yeah. Tightening supplies in some parts of Europe.
Right.
And then the USDA projecting, slightly lower production here in the US.
Right.
And all of this is happening against the backdrop of some pretty significant activity in the dairy futures market.
It's kind of crazy right now, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, we're seeing a lot of volume.
Like over 16,000 tons traded?
Yeah, on the EEX and the SGX.
Right, the European and Singaporean exchanges.
Right.
And that's a lot.
It is. And you know what they say?
What's that?
When futures traders get this active,
right,
they're not just hedging.
Right.
They're panicking. The smart money sees something coming that average producers don't.
So what does that mean?
Well, it means that people who are really tuned into the market,
right,
they're anticipating some big moves.
Right.
They're trying to position themselves to either capitalize on those moves or protect themselves from them.
And that level of activity is unusual.
Yeah, it's definitely above what we would consider normal.
Right. So that's something to pay attention to.
Absolutely.
So with all of this going on, what are the key things that our listeners should be watching?
Well, there are 5 indicators that are highlighted in what we've looked at.
Okay.
First, any revisions to the USDA's WASDE report.
Right.
That's the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates.
Right.
It's their forward-looking projections for supply and demand.
And those projections really influence the price forecasts.
They do.
Okay, so that's the first one.
Yeah. Second, the trading volume on the futures exchanges.
Right, the EEX and SGX.
Right. If you see sustained weekly volume above 7,500 tons, that could be a sign of increased volatility.
Okay.
Third, the fat to protein price ratio.
Yeah.
We talked about that premium for butterfat.
Right.
That's something to keep a close eye on.
Okay.
Fourth, the trend in feed costs.
Right, because that can really impact your bottom line.
Absolutely. Feed is a major expense for dairy producers.
So that's something to monitor closely.
Yeah. And finally, that somewhat puzzling forecast for milk production per cow here in the U.S.
Right. Why is the USDA projecting a decline when you would expect it to be going up?
It's something to keep an eye on.
It is. So we've got a lot to watch.
We do.
It's a complex picture, isn't it?
It is.
You've got these strong fat values in Europe.
All right.
But then this weaker outlook for overall milk prices here in the U.S.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag.
It is. And it seems like this kind of environment is going to create some winners and some losers.
Absolutely. There will be those who are well-positioned to take advantage of these trends, and those who may struggle.
So who are the potential winners here?
Well, based on what we're seeing, producers who are really focused on maximizing components, particularly butterfat, they're in a good spot.
Yeah.
They can benefit from those high fat prices.
Right.
Also, European cheese manufacturers, they're facing potentially tighter milk supplies.
Right.
But demand for cheese is strong.
Right.
So they could do well.
Yeah. And what about producers here in the U.S.?
Well, those who have been proactive about risk management, using hedging strategies to protect themselves from price volatility, they're going to be in a better position than those who haven't taken those steps.
Right. So being proactive is key.
Absolutely. And also those who are really efficient. They've got their costs under control.
Right.
They can withstand some downward pressure on prices.
Right, because their margins are healthier.
Exactly.
So what about the losers then?
Well, those who are just focused on volume.
Right.
Without paying attention to components.
Right.
They could find themselves in trouble.
Right, because if the price of milk is declining.
Right.
But you're not getting a premium for your components.
Right.
Then your margins are going to get squeezed.
Exactly.
And what about those who haven't done any risk management?
Yeah, those who haven't hedged.
Right.
They're exposed.
Yeah.
If those USDA forecasts are accurate.
Right. And prices do come down.
Right.
They're going to feel the pain.
They are. And also those who have high input costs.
Right.
Particularly for feed.
Right.
They're going to be more vulnerable.
Yeah, because their margins are already tighter.
Exactly.
And finally, those who are slow to adapt. to these changing market conditions.
If you're not paying attention
Right.
and you're not making adjustments,
Right.
you're going to fall behind.
Right. So it's all about being proactive,
Absolutely.
informed,
Right.
and adaptable.
Those are the keys to success.
Right. And our sources, they lay out these 5 tough questions that every dairy producer should be asking themselves right now.
These are really important questions.
They are. So let's go through them.
Right.
First, given this premium on butterfat, are you truly maximizing your butterfat production?
That's the first question.
Second, how much of your anticipated 2025 milk production is protected against those lower USDA price forecasts?
Right. Have you hedged?
Right.
Have you taken steps to lock in a price?
Right.
So that you're not exposed to that downside risk.
Right.
Third, are you positioned to benefit if feed costs were to decline?
Okay, so that's thinking about your input costs.
Exactly.
Right.
Are you structured in a way that you can capture those savings if feed prices go down? Fourth, have you really looked at your cash flow? And how a lower average milk price would impact it?
Right. Because you've got to be able to pay the bill.
Absolutely.
Right.
Cash flow is king.
It is.
And finally, does your current plan for expansion still make sense?
Given the reduced forecast for overall milk value.
Right.
So are you chasing volume?
Yeah.
When maybe you should be focusing on value?
Exactly.
Those are tough questions.
They are.
But they're questions that every dairy producer needs to grapple with.
Absolutely.
So if we're looking at a strategic roadmap here, what are the key things that producers should be doing?
Well, I think the first thing is to really focus on those component yields.
Right.
Especially butterfat. Make sure you're doing everything you can to maximize the amount of butterfat in your milk.
Okay.
Second, implement those risk management strategies.
Right.
Hedging is your friend.
Yeah.
Protect yourself from price volatility.
Right.
Third, scrutinize your input costs. Look for every opportunity to drive efficiency.
Right.
And reduce those costs.
Because every penny counts.
It does.
Right.
And finally, make sure you're targeting the right markets.
Okay.
Understand what product streams are most profitable.
Yeah.
And make sure your milk quality is aligned with those markets.
So it's not just about producing milk anymore.
Right.
It's about producing the right kind of milk.
Exactly.
And managing your business in a smart and strategic way.
Absolutely. This isn't time for business as usual. The market is changing.
Yeah.
And you need to change with it.
So to sum it all up,
the
dairy market in 2025 is a complex and potentially volatile picture.
Yeah, there's a lot going on.
We've got this strong emphasis on butterfat value, particularly in Europe.
Right.
But then this downward pressure on overall milk prices.
Especially here in the U.S.
Yeah, so it's a real balancing act.
It is.
And the decisions that producers make today are going to have a big impact on their future. So as we leave our listeners today, I want to leave them with this thought.
Okay.
How might these global shifts and this divergence between the value of fat and protein, how might that reshape the entire dairy industry in the years to come?
That's a great question.
It is. It's something to think about.
It is.
It's not just about the immediate situation.
Right.
It's about the long-term implications.
Absolutely.
And the potential for really fundamental changes.
Right. We could be seeing a real transformation
for
the dairy industry.
So that's something for everyone to ponder.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about.
It is.
Finally, we turn to international trade, where tensions with China are creating ripple effects for U.S. dairy farmers. China's decision to block U.S. beef imports threatens billions in revenue from cull cows. We'll explore how this impacts dairy producers and what steps can be taken to mitigate losses.
Okay, folks, welcome to another deep dive. We like to roll up our sleeves here and really dig into a story that, could really matter for your livelihood.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And today, we're looking at something that's particularly relevant, I think, for anyone involved in agriculture, and specifically, kind of focusing in on the beef industry. And, kind of some surprising connections that it has to other parts of agriculture.
Yeah, for sure.
So the story that we're diving into is China's decision, seemingly, to not renew registrations for a whole bunch of U.S. beef plants. So we're talking about a significant number of facilities that are no longer able to export to mainland China.
Right.
And we're going to be looking at a news article that really breaks down what that means and kind of the domino effect that this could have.
Yeah, and some of the places that domino falls are pretty unexpected, I think.
Exactly. So our mission today is to really untangle this story and figure out why it matters, especially, if you're not directly involved in the beef industry. What are the surprising ways that this can ripple through different agricultural sectors and, maybe even hit your bottom line?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like you said, it might seem like a pretty specific trade issue at first, but the implications are really far-reaching when you start thinking about the bigger picture.
Right. So let's get into the nitty-gritty here. Yeah. So around Sunday, March 16th, 2025, the registrations for, I think it's roughly 390 U.S. beef plants that were operating under that 2020 Phase 1 trade agreement with China reportedly expired and were not renewed. So, for those who aren't familiar with these kinds of trade agreements, can you just kind of paint a picture of what that actually means for these facilities?
Sure. So basically, those plants have lost their authorization to export beef to China. You can think of it like a permit that's expired. Yeah. These registrations were what allowed U.S. beef to enter that Chinese market. And now for a lot of these facilities, that door is essentially closed. And what makes it even more kind of curious is that the registrations for pork and poultry plants were actually renewed. They were extended, pretty far into the future, all the way to 2030.
Wow.
Which makes the fact that beef is being singled out even more striking. It raises questions about what's really going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, that's a big question mark, why those two would be renewed and beef specifically wouldn't.
Yeah.
So what's the immediate economic fallout here? I mean, we're talking about a major market potentially being cut off. So, what kind of dollar figures are we looking at?
Yeah, so the estimated potential loss in U.S. beef exports because of this is somewhere around $4.13 billion, which is a huge chunk of change. It's a significant disruption to how U.S. beef has been flowing into international markets. And, the news article we're looking at specifically mentions that on China's General Administration of Customs website, the status of these beef facilities switched from effective to expired, which is a pretty clear indication that this isn't just a paperwork issue or, some sort of delay. It's a deliberate decision on their part.
Yeah, that's not a good sign. So, this is where I think it starts to connect to a wider audience and, particularly for our listeners. How does this beef export issue with China potentially impact, say, a dairy farmer here in the U.S.?
Right. So this is where it gets really interesting. This connection is something that a lot of people might not realize. So for dairy farmers, a significant portion of their income besides selling milk obviously comes from selling cull cows.
Right.
These are cows that, maybe aren't producing as much milk anymore, so they're sold for beef. And when you have these export opportunities limited, like we're seeing with China, it means more of that beef that would have gone overseas ends up staying in the domestic U.S. market.
Oh.
And when you have an increase in supply, naturally, that's going to put downward pressure on prices. And that includes the prices paid for cull cows. So a dairy farmer who's planning to sell some cull cows could suddenly be facing, a much lower price than they were expecting because of this situation with China.
Wow, it's like a domino effect.
Yeah, exactly. It's an indirect consequence, but it's a very real one.
Less demand for U.S. beef in China leads to more beef here at home.
Yeah.
And that drives down the price for all beef, including those cull cows from dairy farms. Yeah. And, what makes this even more unfortunate is the timing of all of this. The article points out that this is happening when dairy margins are already pretty tight. They've decreased by something like 11%.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely a tough time for dairy farmers. And when milk prices are lower, that income from selling cull cows becomes even more important. It's like a safety net. It helps them weather those storms of low milk prices. But if that safety net is also shrinking because of these depressed cull cow prices, it puts them in a really tough spot.
Yeah, it's like that buffer they rely on is suddenly a lot thinner.
Exactly.
So China restricts U.S. beef, and a dairy farmer, thousands of miles away, feels the pinch in their wallet.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the why here. Why would China do this? What's their motivation?
So the article points to a couple of likely reasons. The first is that there's been these ongoing trade tensions between the U.S. and China for a while now.
Right.
And this could be another move in that larger game of economic chess. They're trying to exert some leverage.
Yeah, it's almost like a retaliatory kind of thing.
Yeah, potentially. And the second reason is probably more directly tied to the beef market itself. There are reports that China's actually been dealing with an oversupply of beef domestically.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, apparently Chinese beef producers were experiencing some financial losses in 2024, and by limiting imports specifically of beef, but not pork and poultry,
right,
it seems like they're trying to protect their own domestic beef industry from those price declines. They want to prop up their own producers.
So it's a strategic decision on their part, looking out for their own internal market and maybe using this as a bargaining chip in these broader trade negotiations.
Right.
So you mentioned the phase one trade deal. Does this situation potentially represent some sort of breach of that agreement?
Well, according to the USDA, China hasn't actually responded to their repeated requests to renew those plant registrations. And the phase one trade deal specifically says that China should update its list of approved plants within 20 days of getting updates from the USDA. So the silence from them definitely raises some eyebrows. Does it violate the terms of that agreement?
It sounds like it could.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that this isn't even the first time this has happened. The article mentions that there were 84 U.S. plant registrations that lapsed back in February of 2025. And while shipments from those plants were initially still getting through customs, it's not clear how long that's going to last. So there's a pattern emerging here. It's not just this sudden big batch of 390.
Right. It's a more gradual kind of erosion of these approvals, which is even more concerning.
Yeah, definitely.
So to really appreciate the scope of this, let's kind of zoom out for a second and look at the bigger picture of meat trade between the U.S. and China.
Sure.
How big of a market is this for American producers?
So the article gives us some helpful numbers. In 2024, the U.S. was China's third largest meat supplier by volume. They exported about 590,000 tons, which is roughly 9% of all the meat that China imported.
Wow, that's a sizable chunk.
And in terms of value, the U.S. was actually the second largest supplier, with exports totaling $2.5 billion.
Wow.
So those figures really illustrate how important the Chinese market is for U.S. meat producers. And that $4.13 billion impact we talked about earlier doesn't just include the direct loss of those exports to China. It also factors in the ripple effect that this could have on prices in other markets.
Oh, right.
So like key export markets for the U.S., like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan.
Okay.
Those prices could also soften because if China, this big buyer, steps back from the global market, overall demand decreases. And that can push prices down even in places where the U.S. can still sell their beef.
So it's not just losing those direct sales. It's also the potential for a wider price drop in a bunch of other important markets.
Exactly. And the article also highlights that certain cuts of beef are going to be particularly vulnerable. The cuts that don't have as much demand here in the U.S.
Right.
If they can't be exported to China where there might be more demand for them, they essentially become a surplus here, driving prices down even further.
So for our listeners who might be, sweating a little bit right now, thinking about how this might affect them, what are some things they can do? What are some proactive steps or strategies they can consider?
Yeah, so the article does outline a few things. One thing producers could think about is adjusting their culling schedules.
Yeah.
So if they have cows that are ready to be culled, maybe it makes sense to try and sell them sooner rather than later before those prices potentially drop even further.
Get ahead of it.
Right. But on the other hand, if they can afford to keep those less productive cows for a little bit longer, they might want to delay culling and hope that the situation with China improves. It's a gamble either way.
Yeah, it's a tough call.
And another option is exploring alternative marketing channels for their dairy beef. So maybe looking into direct marketing to local processors or finding niche markets that might be a little more stable and less reliant on these big export markets.
So thinking outside the box a little bit.
Exactly.
And the article also mentioned some specific risk management tools that are available.
Right. So one of those is the USDA's Livestock Risk Protection, or LRP, insurance program for cull cows. And this insurance can actually cover a pretty significant portion of the expected market value at the end of the insurance period, like 70% to 100%.
Wow, that's pretty good.
Yeah, and the premiums for this coverage are subsidized by the government, so it can be a really helpful option for producers who are worried about those price drops.
That's good to know.
And for producers who are a little more experienced with financial markets, they might want to consider using CME live cattle futures contracts, specifically buying put options on those contracts. This is a way to hedge against potential declines in cattle prices. It's essentially like buying insurance against a price decrease. You pay a premium for the option, but it protects you from some of that downside risk.
So a range of options for producers depending on their comfort level and their experience.
Right.
I think this situation really highlights, how vulnerable many dairy operations have become. They're really reliant on strong cull cow values, especially when milk prices are already struggling.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for a lot of dairy farmers, that income from selling cull cows has become a major factor in their profitability, particularly when milk margins are tight. And This situation with China is a perfect example of how easily that revenue stream can be disrupted by things happening on the global stage. Things that might seem totally unrelated to what they're doing on the farm.
Yeah, it's a real wake-up call.
Right.
So to sum it all up for our listeners, China's decision to essentially block these registrations for U.S. beef plants has the potential to really push down those cull cow prices. And this is happening at a time when a lot of folks in the dairy industry are already dealing with those shrinking profit margins on their milk.
Right. It's a perfect storm.
And the key takeaway here is that this situation is constantly evolving. How this plays out in the long run depends on how these trade relationships change how the market reacts. There's so many interconnected pieces at play.
Yeah, it's a complex issue.
It is. And as you're listening to all of this and kind of digesting it, I want you to think about this. What other global events, things that might not seem directly related to agriculture at first glance, could actually have a huge impact on your operation.
Right.
This situation with beef and dairy is a perfect example of how interconnected our world is, how something happening on the other side of the globe can ripple all the way back to your farm and affect your bottom line.
It really emphasizes the importance of staying informed about what's going on in the world, even things that seem unrelated to agriculture.
Yeah. Knowledge is power in this case. So stay informed, think about those connections, and be proactive about managing your risk in this ever-changing global marketplace.
Couldn't say better myself.
All right, folks, until next time.
That wraps up this week's episode of the Bullvine Weekly Roundup. From community resilience to market challenges, these stories remind us of the complexities and opportunities in our industry. Be sure to visit the Bullvine for more in-depth coverage and resources. Until next time, stay informed and stay strong.